How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 82nd video on my channel, and today we're looking at Recovering a Cripistemology of Pain by Alyson Patsavas, a fascinating paper that explores chronic pain and how its construction intersects with knowledge, culture, and ableist narratives of disability. As a disabled person myself, it's an article that quite deeply resonated with me, so I thought I would do an episode on it. However, before we begin, I think a content warning is important. This video will deal with suicide or suicidal ideation, although not in any graphic way. With that in mind, let's get into it. Patsavas begins the paper by focusing on the place that pain occupies in pop culture. From films to the justifications of real serial killers, there is a pervasive view of chronic pain as a fate worse than death. A narrative that is often weaponized against disabled people, even by those with apparently good intentions. It essentially crushes subjects who deal with chronic pain by considering their lives as nothing but devastation and tragedy. There's often no real room for nuance or complexity. Subjects with chronic pain are nothing except that pain, with no attention given to their complex and rich realities. Even though a lot of work has been done in disability studies to question this approach, particularly the implication that chronic pain entails a desire to die, it still infests cultural narratives about what it means to be disabled. As Patsavas explains,
the belief that all disabled people experience pain and that all pain leads to suffering runs through popular discourses to create entrenched ways of knowing pain and disability.
This ultimately shapes how pain itself is experienced. Offering a passage from an old pain journal, Patsavas discusses a time she struggled with suicidal thoughts. At that point, she felt that dying could give her relief from pain, a thought process that, as she herself puts it, is easy to consider as a simple equation. However, it's important to deconstruct that. What gives rise to such a logic? The belief that suicide is preferable to living with pain doesn't come out of nowhere. It reflects cultural narratives about the quality of disabled life, which render suicidality tragic, yet understandable. In Patsavas' words,
the cultural discourses that frame pain as an isolating, devastating experience crystallize to prevent the exploration of alternative explanations for why chronic pain might be or seem to be unlivable.
Quoting Desiring Pain, Desiring Distress by Margaret Price, she stresses that the reason why we need to think more carefully about pain is not necessarily to overcome the pain itself, but to overcome the many oppressions that attempt to annihilate us for feeling pain. It wasn't her disability alone that made Patsavas consider suicide, at least not in any non-qualified way. She relates that her journal entry followed a loss of access to care. Because she didn't agree to an experimental treatment, her pain clinic marked her as unwilling to recover and stopped seeing her as a patient. Without a referral to another clinic, she was also unable to refill her prescriptions. She went from 6 different medications at high doses to essentially nothing. The pain was undeniably an incredibly important factor in how what Patsavas describes as her ability to imagine a livable life became precarious, but treating it like it's the only one would be to fundamentally misunderstand the situation. To give just one early example here, her loss of access to medication was intimately intertwined with cultural worries about the growing opioid epidemic. It's impossible to dissociate chronic pain and its construction as tragic from politics and structural conditions. Getting into the second section of her paper, titled A Cripistemology of Pain, Patsavas defines the titular concept as a process of producing knowledge that situates pain within discursive systems of power and privilege. To put this another way, a cripistemology serves to uncover how structural factors, such as those linked to culture, economics, and so on, influence the ways in which disability is understood, particularly when it comes to the devaluation of disabled lives. Explaining the origin of the word cripistemology itself, Patsavas writes,
the method referenced by this term combines the process of cripping with standpoint epistemology, which acknowledges that the subject positions from which we produce knowledge matter.
To break this down, Cripping involves interrogating mainstream representations of things like disability and revealing the able-bodied assumptions that lie within them. Standpoint epistemology, on the other hand, is closely tied to feminist philosophy and focuses on the role of experience in the production of knowledge. This approach is based on the recognition of a fact that there isn't really any such thing as a truly neutral knowledge. Power dynamics are always in play, conditioning it. As a result, the positions and experiences of the elements involved in knowing or understanding something cannot be ignored. Although Patsavas expressly doesn't want to go into too much depth regarding the critiques directed at such an experience-based epistemology, she does point out that privilege is embedded into many of them. It's easy enough to say that knowledge is neutral when you aren't excluded from its production, but that doesn't reflect the reality that many people face. Just look at the medical model of disability. With the valorization of supposedly impartial experts like doctors, disabled people have long been systematically excluded from what Patsavas describes as more formal processes of knowledge production, even when it comes to our own lives and pain. This leads to incredibly frustrating situations built around a strange sort of hierarchization of knowledge, or else a double bind of sorts. On the one hand, our experiences as disabled people are dismissed because we don't have the appropriate expertise. On the other hand, even if we have that expertise, even if we occupy positions associated with more formal knowledge production, we are still dismissed for a lack of impartiality. With this in mind, Patsavas touches on the politics of it all.
The dismissal of experience obstructs knowledge of, by, for disabled people, as systems of privilege facilitate biomedical knowledge about pain, not just by excluding, but by devaluing experiential knowledge.
Returning to her specific Cripistemology of Pain, these insights translate to a project that produces knowledge experientially while simultaneously marking its own limits. When you are working with Cripistemology, it's important to acknowledge your own positions. As Patsavas is careful to underline, you can't just assume that you perfectly understand another person's experiences. This is why she explicitly describes herself as white, queer, female, and middle class. Patsavas isn't engaging in identity politics or treating those categories as static. She's contextualizing and positioning her experiences and the things that frame how she produces knowledge. Even if this can only be done imperfectly and partially, due to the ever-shifting nature of such positions, it's still important to point them out. With this in mind, we can explore how the rest of the paper will be structured. Patsavas' method consists of presenting American cultural narratives of chronic pain, epitomized in a series of 5 articles across over 3 decades from Time magazine, and interweaving entries of her own journals, exploring them as junctions where all sorts of discourses about pain intersect. By then incorporating her current memory of her experiences from the time of the journal passages, she also explores the role of the ever-shifting in how she relates to disability. The result is an account capable of registering the complex ways in which different discourses overlap and contradict one another, something only possible through a cripistemological approach. To be a little more specific, Patsavas says that a cripistemology of pain intervenes in 4 main ways. First of all, it traces what she describes as the discursive systems that materially produce and structure experiences of pain, an example of which can be found in the earlier case of losing access to medication. Second, it develops a cultural analysis of pain that doesn't ignore its corporeal or bodily dimensions. Next, her cripistemology seeks to examine the actual felt experiences that arise out of cultural discourses. As she showed with her journal entry, narratives surrounding chronic pain are not at all abstract. They have incredibly concrete repercussions. All of this essentially coalesces in the 4th dimension of cripistemology.
It situates those experiences of cultural discourses within a broader cultural politics of ableism, or what Tobin Siebers calls an ideology of ability.
Beginning with the articles from Time magazine, these construct a narrative of pain as life-ruining through the complementary use of text and images. These two images come from 2007 and 2005 respectively, the former blurring the line between actual flesh and papier-mâché, whilst the latter mixes the monstrous and uncanny to create the sense that pain reduces people down into nothing but what hurts. Focusing on the 2005 article, titled The Right and Wrong Way to Treat Pain, Patsavas points out how disability is often framed.
It calls chronic pain a thief that breaks into your body and robs you blind, until you are left with nothing but a world that has collapsed into a cramped cell of suffering.
This framing, which puts the value of disabled life and its quality into question, is mirrored in another article from Time, published in March of 2011, titled Healing the Hurt. Here, as you can see, the accompanying inner cover is of an almost alien figure, silhouetted with light that disappears at the ends of her body. As Patsavas mentions, despite the figure's lack of specific features, they are still gendered female, a reflection of the cultural stereotypes around who experiences chronic pain. On the textual level, the author of the article describes how living with a disability amounts to persistent, unceasing torment. Together, the effect this generates is one of reduction. The chronically pained subject is their pain. For Patsavas, articles like The Right and Wrong Way to Treat Pain and Healing the Hurt contribute to a devaluation of disabled lives. She acknowledges that their authors don't directly state or consciously believe that chronic pain makes life not worth living, and that they might have the best intentions, thinking they're actually helping those in pain. But, at the end of the day, those facts still don't change the end result. In her own words,
they nevertheless call into question the quality of a life lived in pain and paint a picture of the person experiencing pain as a creature reduced to less than human status.
Concluding this section of the paper, Patsavas associates the narratives that are transmitted through and incarnated in these articles with what disability theorist Rosemary Garland-Thompson calls the cultural logic of euthanasia, even though she doesn't want to draw any direct causal links between such a logic and her experiences with suicidal thoughts. Patsavas does want to contextualize her situation. The assumption that death is the only way to end your suffering as a disabled person doesn't come out of nowhere. It has a cultural framing that ties into Margaret Price's notion of oppressions that seek to annihilate us for feeling pain. Beginning a section titled Recovery, Patsavas turns her focus to biomedicine and its narratives. In particular, she describes how it establishes pain as an individual experience that is both increasingly knowable, in the sense that new technology makes it easier to understand, and something to be avoided at all costs. This comes out of broader discourses that see disability as suffering that first and foremost must be cured, falling under the banner of a medical model of disability. If you aren't familiar with the concept, which only appears implicitly in this paper, the medical model considers disabilities, like chronic pain, as problems that can be solved through treatment alone, personal abnormalities for which it is the disabled individual's duty to fix. This approach has long been criticized in disability studies, but, as Patsavas relates, the view that chronic pain specifically is a private and tragic experience still remains strong even there. As a result, there is a flattening of how it is understood. To paraphrase the text almost exactly, seeing pain as something other than tragic, as pleasurable, enlightening, or even simply non-life shattering, is considered perverse. The focus on a cure becomes overbearing, albeit in a nuanced way.
I would not necessarily turn down medical advances that alleviate or eliminate my chronic pain, but the uncomplicated quest for a medical cure makes curing pain not only desirable, but also compulsory.
Patsavas offers her own experiences as showing a way in which such a focus can prove harmful. As she went through the process of diagnosis, her doctors became more and more frustrated. They couldn't seem to identify the problem, dismissing what she was feeling and maintaining that she was, or should be, healthy. As a result, she internalized shame and guilt, writing in a journal that she should be punished for the pain she was unable to control, and that she felt she was inflicting on others. Alongside noting the failure she used to feel, Patsavas reflects on how her understanding of pain has changed.
I see how clear it is that we never experience pain in isolation. How differently might I have felt the pain in a context where interdependence is acknowledged and valued.
With cultural narratives of pain, like those demonstrated by the articles from Time, the theme of personal responsibility is everywhere. Even though Healing the Hurt, for example, recognizes barriers to treatment, the author still stresses to readers that there are still many options out there for relief. This kind of reassurance implicitly suggests that those in pain are such because they aren't trying hard enough. Help is out there, so why don't they take it? This is particularly prominent in the other article we looked at, The Right and Wrong Way to Treat Pain. Here, the pharmaceutical industry, and by extension its profits, figures quite heavily. Discussing the life of one person who experienced a severe back injury, the article contrasts the activities she used to be able to do with what she now does to deal with the pain. This portrayal does two things. One, it constructs chronic pain as a devastating and life-destroying experience, seen with the eulogy to old activities. Two, it simultaneously reassures readers by stressing that there's still medical help out there. However, there's still yet another dimension, that of the drugs themselves. The title, at least in part, acts to establish the article as a sort of obituary to two drugs that were temporarily taken off the market by the FDA. This leads to an odd situation where the commodification of pain is considered in a good light, even in spite of competing narratives regarding opioid abuse and the overavailability of painkillers. Taken together, these discourses produce what essentially amounts to a double bind for those with chronic pain.
They bind them within a discursive system that offers a cure through consumption, condemns the individual for using that cure, and holds the individual responsible when that cure does not work.
In this light, the Time articles establish those with chronic pain as outliers who exist only because they personally fail to get proper treatment. Talking about her personal experiences, Patsavas describes how other people often ask her if she has tried yoga, acupuncture, and so on to get over her pain. Despite their good intentions, these questions are dismissive in nature. They contribute to framing chronic pain as a personal thing that you can just get over by trying hard enough. The goal of a Cripistemology of Pain is to examine how such discourses affect how pain is experienced. Going all the way back to 1984, a particularly egregious example of how it is presented as an individual problem appears in a Time article titled Unlocking Pain Secrets. In it, the author cites things like low motivation, poor self-image, and dependency on others as risk factors for chronic pain. Embedded within cultural discourses even today, this view of pain as something based on personal character flaws essentially separates it from the structural contexts that condition it. Patsavas, giving her own experience with pain as an example, explains that it emerged at the intersection of the discourses of athleticism and butch stoicism. Her pain originated from a sports injury when she was young that she didn't acknowledge at first. Continuing to play softball, she saw pushing through her pain as a way to overcome supposed character flaws. As Patsavas describes, looking back,
I can de-individualize the self-loathing I once expressed by recognizing it as shaped by cultural discourses of the lazy, selfish, shameful, disabled person.
When you think about chronic pain and disability as biological and nothing else, it's easy to ignore how narratives linked to athleticism and things like personal responsibility or individualism can lead a teenager to, as Patsavas puts it, think that admitting she can barely grip a softball, much less pitch another game, is tantamount to failure. Another important dimension to this can be found in gender and sexuality, which intersect quite fundamentally with discourses of athleticism. For Patsavas specifically, she relates that her desire to prove her athletic capabilities partially came out of a desire to distance herself from the cultural image of girls as weak. As she describes, she wanted to prove that she could tough out the pain like any man. Because she kept trying to push through it, her cartilage eroded, and she lost the ability to even hold a ball. A purely biological view of her pain would fail to understand the structural side of it, like the athletic ideology that ties self-worth to physical ability. Although Patsavas says that she sees a queer Crip reading of pain slowly emerge in the entries of her journal, she is also careful to resist a simple narrative of progress or triumph that goes from suicidality to political awareness, or from disability to psychological recovery via new ways of thinking. It doesn't really work like that. She still has struggles with managing her pain, just like in the past, she had periods without struggle. Nevertheless, that doesn't mean this isn't a narrative of recovery.
Unlike the countless medical procedures and inspirational texts bearing the same label, this process recovers the cultural, medical, and political discourses that shape experiences of pain.
The recovery narrative that Patsavas wants to develop serves to de-individualize experiences of pain, not focusing on her own personal health per se, but instead searching for what she describes as remnants of pain as a cultural event. In another journal passage, she talks about how she might not be suicidal now, but she is scared that she might be again if things get worse with the doctors, a fear that many people with disabilities can relate to. The goal of recovery in Cripistemology is to uncover the connective tissue that binds the various experiences that contribute to pain and how it's understood together, like the very real concerns about the opioid epidemic, the test that doctors use to examine whether someone's pain is valid, and the ways in which disability can make you fall behind in school or become isolated, not to mention the very experience of trying again. It is crucial not to treat these as individual things. As Patsavas stresses again and again, it is crucial to recover the politics of pain. This leads us to the second to last section of the paper, titled Leaky Bodies and Connective Tissue. With it, Patsavas' goal is to underline that pain, like disability more generally, cannot be understood as an individual thing. Drawing on Margaret Shildrick's concept of leaky bodies, she writes,
I argue for a queer Crip understanding of pain as a fluid, relational, and leaky experience that flows through, across, and between always already connected bodies.
To illustrate this, she turns to an entry in a journal that was written not long after the one about feeling suicidal. At the time, Patsavas says she felt quite isolated. She had left home to go to university, losing her old sources of support and even getting further from the athleticism that once framed her relationship with pain. Although she underlines that it would be an oversimplification to say that her desperation would have been prevented with those sources of support around, connections with others are still crucial. In the journal entry, Patsavas describes meeting someone who had similar experiences with pain, providing her with a broader community. As she reflects now,
I could connect with someone who did not need an explanation for the pain. I could imagine others experiencing pain. I could imagine pain beyond just my bodily experience.
It's with this that Patsavas shifts her attention to the notion that pain is not only unshareable, but something that breaks down language. It's a belief that's quite pervasive, one that many people with disabilities, including a younger Patsavas, hold or have held. However, it's necessary to interrogate it, as well as the cultural logic that underpins it. A 1980 article in Time magazine characterizes chronic pain as a complete sense of helplessness and despair that only a victim can truly understand, whilst doctors often seem afraid to name it at all. However, Patsavas asks if it's not ableism that makes this so. In the case of her doctors, was their apparent fear not instead a refusal to acknowledge her experiences as painful? Looking at expression and its absence in another light, she turns to a passage from her journal directed at her lover. There, not talking about pain has a pleasurable dimension as a part of performing butchness. They have moments where the pain enters or leaks into their relationship, but in a very specific, limited way. Desire thus plays a particularly important part in why pain might be unsaid, separate from reasons that could be characterized as medicalized and isolating. In her own words,
unlike many doctors' unwillingness to speak directly about pain or a general belief in its inexpressibility, we re-signify the silence around pain as a form of desire.
As Patsavas admits, the pleasure that comes with this is itself tied up in certain cultural discourses about intimacy and partnership, but it still serves to illustrate how things can be considered in terms of connectivity. When she uses the term leaky body and its derivatives, she stresses that the boundaries between subjects are just as discursive as flesh-based. With pain, it isn't just her experience. It leaks onto her lover, her family, and her friends. Boundaries blur as these experiences overlap and influence each other. As crip theorist Alyson Patsavas says, disability is experienced in and through relationships, the exact same applying for pain. It is crucial to move away from cultural narratives that frame it as an individual personal experience in order to recognize this fact. Going beyond romantic relationships, the leakiness of pain can be found in all sorts of places, including the doctor-patient connection. As Patsavas puts it,
we are beings moving in a discursive dimension where bodies, patients, and doctors signify certain things, and those discourses influence how we understand the materiality of the moment.
Power is particularly important here. The doctor is in a position to evaluate and validate pain, providing or not providing relief that is crucial for surviving. On the individual level, they also carry a history of seeing thousands of patients describing pain, just like Patsavas says she brings a history of having her concerns dismissed by medical practitioners. Additionally, on the collective level, Patsavas carries a history of women who experience pain being ignored for supposedly hysterical behavior, whilst the doctor has a history imparted by medical training that treats those in pain with suspicion. By acknowledging connectivity, Patsavas says it's possible to better understand these histories and intersecting discourses without forgetting the material dimension of pain, as well as without ignoring how social and cultural factors play a role in how pain is felt on a fundamental level. It is on this note that we get to the conclusion of the article, simply titled Imagining, as Patsavas begins.
Do I still desire to die? No. However, it would be presumptuous to assume that I will always occupy the same position or have the same experience in relationship to pain that I do now.
At the end of the day, her cripistemology is inspired by political urgency. With even her self-admittedly privileged access to support, Patsavas is in a precarious position. The US seems to be erecting more and more barriers to healthcare by the day, and acknowledging the structural conditions that play a part in suffering and its dynamics is deeply important. Reflecting on the possibility of becoming suicidal again, Patsavas says that she hopes that she'll be able to recognize what influences her feelings and what her leakiness means relative to those around her. Closing off the paper, she discusses the aims of her project.
It is my hope that cripistemologies materialize in ways that permit us to think pain otherwise, to produce painful new knowledge, but also to construct analyses about pain that are less painful.
It's with this that we conclude Recovering a Cripistemology of Pain by Alyson Patsavas, having examined how chronic pain can be understood as influenced and constructed through cultural discourses. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments, so I can do better. Next time, we'll likely be continuing with Science and Machines by Maurizio Lazzarato. Until then, bye!